On a quiet Tuesday night, October 30th, 2024, in Columbus, Ohio, most families were fast asleep, children tucked into their beds, porch lights flickering, the kind of night where nothing unusual was expected. But on one street, the silence was violently broken. A van thundered through the neighborhood with police cruisers racing close behind, their sirens screaming into the cold night air. Officers would later admit they had never witnessed anything like it in their careers, an image so disturbing, they struggled to put it into words. Because behind that van, something was being dragged along the asphalt, something that would haunt them forever. By the time the chase came to a crashing halt, one life had been stolen in the most brutal way, and an entire community was left stunned, whispering the same question. How did a marriage come to this? To understand, we must go back, years before that October night, when the story began. Before we continue, this is the Crime Catalogue. Stay tuned, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. It was the summer of 2016 in Columbus, Ohio. Rebecca, just 24 at the time, worked as a receptionist at a small community clinic on the east side of town. She wasn't a nurse or a doctor, but the kind of young woman who made patients feel welcome the moment they walked in. Friends later recalled how she always had that soft smile, the one that could calm even the most nervous visitor. That summer afternoon, Maxwell Turner stepped through the clinic doors. He was older, 32, confident in the way he carried himself, yet there was something about the way he looked at Rebecca that lingered. She noticed him, too. Their exchange was brief. Papers, signatures, a polite laugh over a wrong date written on a form. But for reasons neither of them could explain, that moment stayed with them. Weeks later, he returned, not just for his checkup, but, as some would quietly suspect, to see her. And soon, what began as small talk at the front desk turned into coffee dates, then long evening walks around Columbus parks, where they spoke about their dreams, their families, and the kind of future they wanted. To their friends, it seemed like a romance pulled from the pages of a storybook, unexpected, yet undeniable. By 2017, Rebecca wore a white dress, Maxwell a dark suit, as they stood before family and friends and promised each other forever. Wedding photographs still capture that night. Rebecca's glowing smile, Maxwell holding her hand firmly as though he would never let go. For a while, that promise seemed true. 2 children followed not long after, a boy and a girl. They became the glue of the Turners' young marriage. Photos showed birthdays with balloons and frosting smeared across little faces, Sunday mornings at church, and holiday dinners where Rebecca and Maxwell looked like the perfect couple who had everything figured out. But perfection has a way of hiding the cracks beneath the surface. What began as a chance meeting in a clinic would one day unravel into a story investigators described as one of the most disturbing crimes in Franklin County's history. At first glance, the Turners seemed like a picture-perfect family. 2 kids, a home in the suburbs, smiles at church on Sundays. But behind closed doors, the cracks in that picture began to show almost immediately. Within the first few years of their marriage, Maxwell's charm, the very confidence that had once drawn Rebecca in, began to take on a darker edge. His jealousy surfaced in subtle ways at first, questions that felt more like interrogations, suspicious glances when her phone buzzed, comments about how long she lingered after work. And then it grew bolder. He accused her of cheating whenever she stayed late at the clinic, demanding to know who she was with, why she hadn't rushed home the moment her shift ended. Neighbors would later recall the sound of shouting carrying through the thin walls of the quiet Columbus Street. Some remembered seeing Rebecca standing on the porch late at night, her face pale in the glow of the streetlight, as Maxwell's voice roared from inside. Others said the fights were so loud they had no choice but to call police. Records confirm that officers were dispatched to the Turner home on more than one occasion. But every time, Rebecca smoothed things over. She explained it away as a misunderstanding, or told officers Maxwell was just under stress. The reports show no arrests. The cycle repeated. Friends would later struggle to explain why she stayed. But those closest to Rebecca knew her heart. Too loyal, too hopeful, always believing that if she just loved hard enough, if she just stayed patient, the man she married would resurface. She always thought love could change him, one friend said, voice breaking when recounting those early years. And so, Rebecca covered the bruises with makeup, hid the arguments behind practiced smiles, and protected Maxwell from consequences that might have forced him to face his demons. But there were moments when her mask slipped, moments that haunted those who heard her words. Once, during a quiet conversation with a close friend, Rebecca confessed something chilling. She said, "If something happens to me, just know I tried my best to love him." At the time, her friend brushed it off as exaggeration, the kind of heavy statement people sometimes make in frustration. But in hindsight, those words now feel like a warning she whispered into the void, a prophecy no one took seriously until it was far too late. And so the cycle of love, fear, and silence continued. Rebecca remained the shield, protecting Maxwell from the world, and perhaps, in her mind, protecting her children from the chaos that might follow if she walked away. But as history has shown in countless tragedies like this one, unchecked patterns only escalate. And what began as shouting matches and jealous accusations was slowly hardening into something more dangerous. But why would a woman so full of compassion continue shielding a man who terrified her? By 2021, Rebecca Turner was no longer the shy clinic receptionist who first met Maxwell. She was a mother, a wife, and above all, a woman with ambition. Her children were growing, and with every new school year, with every new need that arose in their lives, Rebecca began to see the urgency of carving out a future that did not rely entirely on Maxwell's unstable hands. That is why she enrolled in evening nursing classes. Her dream was simple: earn her license, secure a stable career, and give her children a future brighter than her present. For Rebecca, it was never about prestige or status. It was about security, dignity, and hope. She often told her classmates that she wanted her kids to be proud of her, that she wanted them to look back and see their mother not just as someone who survived, but as someone who built something meaningful for them. But for Maxwell, Rebecca's dream was not inspiring. It was infuriating. He could not understand that her late nights were spent studying medical charts and practicing patient care. In his mind, every moment she spent away from him was a betrayal. Every book, every lab coat, every classmate. He twisted them into proof that she was seeing someone else. His jealousy festered like an open wound. At first, it was just constant calls and text messages while she was in class. Angry questions, demands to know where she was, accusations disguised as concern. Then it escalated. Maxwell began showing up at her evening classes, sometimes waiting in the parking lot, other times walking inside, his voice echoing in the hallway as he accused her of lying. Imagine the humiliation. Your classmates watching, your professor trying to continue the lecture, while your husband storms in, glaring at everyone as though the entire room is conspiring against him. For Rebecca, these were not just interruptions. They were deliberate attacks on her dignity. When she returned home from training shifts, instead of being met with support or warmth, she was met with interrogation. Maxwell would corner her in the living room, demanding explanations about who she sat next to, who gave her a ride, who looked at her for too long. Sometimes his words were cutting, dripping with venom. Other times, his anger took on a quieter, more chilling form. Long silences, slammed doors, or a look in his eyes that said more than words ever could. And yet, Rebecca kept going. She kept her head down, kept attending classes, kept reaching for her dream, even though every step forward seemed to provoke Maxwell into pulling her 2 steps back. Friends would later say they admired her determination, but they also worried. They saw the toll it was taking. Her once bright smile began to dim. Her laughter, once effortless, now sounded rehearsed. In private moments, Rebecca's closest friend recalled, she confessed her fears. She admitted that Maxwell's jealousy frightened her, that she didn't know how much longer she could balance her own safety with her desire to succeed. And in one haunting conversation, she posed a question that would later chill that friend to the bone. If something ever happens to me, at least you'll know I tried. I really tried. For my kids, for myself, for him too. Her words were not a dramatic flourish. They were a foreshadow of the storm to come. Because for Maxwell, Rebecca's success was not just threatening, it was unbearable. If you were Rebecca, caught between your dreams and a husband who threatens you, what would you have done? Would you keep pushing forward, or give up your future to keep the peace at home? The neighbors had long grown used to the unsettling rhythm of Maxwell and Rebecca's home, an uneasy music that broke into their quiet nights. It began with raised voices, his sharp and commanding, hers pleading and fractured. Then came the crashes. A chair tipped over, glass shattering, doors slammed with such force the whole house seemed to shake. In those moments, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, the sounds spilling into their lives whether they wanted them or not. Some neighbors peeked through blinds, others pressed their ears against walls, but all of them carried the same heavy knowledge, that something inside that house was deeply wrong. One woman remembered a night that haunted her still. She had been folding laundry when she heard Rebecca's voice through the open window, trembling and raw. "Please stop, Max. Please." The sobs that followed were so fragile, so desperate, that the neighbor froze, basket in hand, too afraid to intervene, too ashamed later for doing nothing. Another neighbor, an elderly man, recalled seeing Rebecca the following morning on her way to the corner shop. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy weather, her steps slow, her shoulders rounded in a way that spoke louder than words. She carried herself like a woman trying not to exist, he would later say. The police, too, had become familiar with the address. Late-night calls summoned them to the house more than once, red and blue lights painting the cul-de-sac with urgency. But the reports always read the same: verbal dispute, domestic disturbance, no arrest made. To the officers, it looked routine, a cycle with no resolution. Each time, Rebecca stood at the door, pale but determined, assuring them it was nothing, just an argument, just stress. Her words were a shield, spoken not out of truth, but out of a dangerous loyalty to the man who hurt her. Some suspected fear held her tongue, others believed love, warped into something unrecognizable, chained her there. Whatever the reason, her silence built the cage in which she lived. Among neighbors, whispers spread. They spoke of Rebecca's haunted eyes, of how her laughter, which once floated easily across fences during summer afternoons, had grown rare, almost extinct. They noticed how she stopped attending church gatherings, how she no longer lingered on the porch in the evenings, how even her clothes seemed chosen to conceal rather than express. There was talk of intervention, of calling social services, of stepping in. But talk was all it became. Fear, uncertainty, and the belief that it was not their place silenced them as effectively as fear silenced her. Each passing day, the walls of that house became more than wood and brick. They became accomplices to secrets too painful to bear. This is the cruel paradox of abuse. The victim becomes both shield and prisoner, defending the very hands that bruise them. Rebecca's silence was not weakness. It was survival, but survival at a cost. And so the question lingers, heavy and foreboding. How long can someone live in fear before fear itself becomes the weapon that ends them? By 2023, the fragile threads holding Maxwell and Rebecca together had nearly snapped. What once appeared to be an ordinary marriage, two young parents raising children, had transformed into a battlefield, their home no longer a sanctuary but a war zone charged with suspicion, control, and unspoken terror. Maxwell's paranoia, once scattered in bouts of jealousy, now hardened into a daily ritual. He began isolating Rebecca with frightening precision. Friends who had once visited the house noticed their invitations quietly stopped coming. Calls went unanswered, texts were delayed, sometimes read but never replied to. Behind closed doors, Maxwell had taken control of her phone, holding it hostage for hours under the guise of protection. In truth, it was surveillance, an attempt to sift through imagined betrayals that never existed. He demanded proof of her whereabouts at all times, forcing her to send photos when she was out, interrogating her about minor details, like why a shopping trip took 20 minutes longer than expected. For Rebecca, the suffocation was unbearable, but she carried it with quiet endurance, always hoping things might change for the sake of the children. But the children could not be shielded from the storm forever. They witnessed too much. Night after night, arguments erupted like gunfire, sometimes over trivial matters, sometimes over nothing at all. The children learned the cruel ritual: retreat into their small shared room, clutch each other, and cry in silence as their parents fought on the other side of the wall. The sound of shattering glass, Maxwell's booming accusations, Rebecca's muffled sobs, it became the soundtrack of their young lives. and though no hand was raised against them directly, the children bore invisible wounds, growing up in the shadow of fear. Rebecca's friends, those who managed to glimpse her at church or in passing, noticed the physical toll. Her once bright spirit dimmed under the weight of exhaustion. She was thinner, her smile forced, her eyes distant as if they carried secrets too heavy to share. She brushed off their concerns with excuses. "I've just been tired from school," or "Max has been under a lot of stress," but her body betrayed her words. She carried the unmistakable look of someone under siege. Behind her rehearsed reassurances, she knew what she dared not say. She was living with a man unraveling, and the unraveling was swallowing her whole. For shadow came not in screams, but in whispers. At least twice, Rebecca confided in close friends with words that should have shaken the world awake. "I'm scared of what he might do one day," she admitted, her voice trembling. It wasn't just fear of another argument. It was dread, an intuitive sense that Maxwell's obsession was spiraling towards something irreversible. But like many victims, Rebecca's plea was subtle, wrapped in layers of loyalty, shame, and the belief that perhaps things could still improve. Her friends offered comfort, advice, even encouragement to leave, but no one fully grasped how close the danger loomed. The tragedy of cycles like this is not just that they repeat, but that they escalate. Maxwell was no longer merely jealous. He was consumed, and in that consumption, he drew Rebecca and the children deeper into his chaos. Every confrontation, every slammed door, every night of tears pushed the family closer to a line no one dared to name but everyone sensed. She said she was scared of what he might do. Those words now echo like prophecy, a warning whispered but never truly heard. Was her fear the final chance for someone to intervene? Or was it already too late? Was her fear a warning that no one truly heard? By October 2024, Rebecca's life had become a silent battlefield. To outsiders, she was still the polite mother walking her children to school and exchanging half-smiles with neighbors. But behind closed doors, her world was collapsing. That month, in a rare moment of courage, she confided to a close friend during a hushed phone call that she wanted to leave Maxwell. Her voice trembled, her words soaked with fear. I don't think I can survive here anymore. If I try to go, he'll kill me." It wasn't the kind of exaggeration friends sometimes hear in broken marriages. It was a warning, raw and desperate. Rebecca had begun searching for apartments online in secret, sneaking moments late at night after Maxwell had fallen asleep. She clicked through listings, looking for small, modest spaces where she and her children could feel safe, free, and away from the suffocating tension of the house. Each search felt like a whisper of hope, but also a dangerous game of chance, because she knew one wrong move could expose her. But Maxwell was already suspicious. His paranoia had turned into obsession. He monitored her movements, questioned her calls, and demanded to know who she spoke with. One evening, when Rebecca left her phone unattended for just a few minutes, Maxwell went through it. He found the history, the apartment searches, the bookmarked listings. His face twisted with fury. When Rebecca walked back into the room, she found him sitting still, holding her phone like it was a weapon. The silence was more terrifying than a scream. That night, his rage exploded. He cornered her in their bedroom, veins pulsing at his temples, his voice sharp and cutting. "If you leave me," he hissed, "you won't live to see another man." It was no longer just manipulation. It was a death sentence spoken aloud. Rebecca froze. Fear had become her shadow, but in that moment, it grew into something suffocating, something inescapable. The children, barely old enough to grasp the magnitude of what was unraveling, overheard muffled arguments through the walls. Their small bodies curled under blankets as tears stained their pillows, listening to the storm brewing between their parents. To them, home had become a war zone. Rebecca's friends noticed the toll, her face gaunt, her weight dropping, her eyes carrying a heaviness that spoke louder than her words ever could. Still, she minimized, she deflected, she smiled when she had to. Every sign was there. Every warning was flashing. Rebecca had voiced her fear. She had even predicted the unthinkable. Yet, no one truly grasped that she wasn't just venting about a bad marriage. She was living under a threat that was becoming more real by the day. And so the chilling question lingers for us now. Was this the moment Maxwell crossed the line in his mind, silently deciding that if he couldn't keep Rebecca, no one else ever would? October 30th, 2024. The air in the Turner neighborhood carried the weight of silence that only late-night hours could hold. But that calm was violently shattered when neighbors were startled by a loud crash from inside the Turner home. A sound so piercing, so desperate, that those who heard it would later describe it as a noise you don't forget. It was not just the sound of glass breaking or furniture toppling. It was the sound of a home imploding under years of rage and fear. Inside, police believe, an argument had spiraled into a storm. Rebecca had reached the end of her endurance. She wanted out, and Maxwell knew it. To him, it wasn't just rejection. It was humiliation, betrayal, and the ultimate loss of control. His voice thundered through the walls, neighbors would later say, echoing with an anger that no longer sounded human. Rebecca's cries, muffled and desperate, punctuated the chaos before they fell silent. Investigators pieced together what followed. The crash had been the moment Maxwell's rage erupted physically. Rebecca suffered a brutal head injury, so severe that police concluded she was fatally wounded even before the night's most gruesome act began. The blow that silenced her also sealed her fate. But Maxwell wasn't finished. In the aftermath of his violence, something darker took hold, something that went beyond murder. He dragged her lifeless body across the cold tile floor, his breath heavy, his motions frantic, as though consumed by a twisted mission. He fetched a rope, tied it tightly around her ankles, and in a moment that even seasoned detectives would later struggle to describe without shuddering, he dragged her outside and tied her to his van. What came next unfolded like a nightmare stitched into reality. Witnesses described the surreal horror of flashing red and blue lights cutting through the night, the sound of tires screeching against asphalt, and the sickening image of Rebecca's body being dragged on the cold asphalt that night behind the vehicle. The police, alerted by frantic neighbors, arrived to chase a man who was no longer fleeing justice. He was fleeing sanity itself. Sirens wailed. The chase careened through quiet streets, the grotesque sight of a body tied to a van playing out like a scene from the darkest of films. Officers shouted into their radios, desperate to stop what they were witnessing, while neighbors, frozen at their windows, stood in paralyzed horror. This was not just domestic violence anymore. It was something primal, a man unraveling in the most public and merciless way possible. What makes a man take the woman he once vowed to protect, the mother of his children, and turn her into an object of cruelty? At what point does love rot into possession, and devotion into destruction? The chase would eventually end. The van, cornered by pursuing police, screeched to a halt. The silence that followed was unbearable. When officers approached, weapons drawn, they found Maxwell, his face drenched in sweat, his eyes wide, a man consumed by the chaos he had unleashed. Behind him, the body of Rebecca told the final story. The years of warnings, the cries for help, the bruises and whispers all leading to this night of horror. And then the voice softens, leaving the audience in stillness. This was no longer just the tragedy of a broken marriage. It was the annihilation of a woman who once dreamed of love, children, and peace. And it was the night the community learned how thin the line is between devotion and destruction. What makes a man take the woman he once vowed to protect, and instead treat her with such cruelty? The pursuit came to a grinding halt when Maxwell's van, battered from the chase, finally lost momentum at the edge of a desolate stretch of highway. Police cruisers surrounded him on all sides, red and blue lights painting the night in an almost surreal glow, their beams dancing across the body that had been dragged until it could no longer be recognized. Officers shouted commands through megaphones, their voices slicing through the cold October air. "Step out of the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." For a tense moment, there was silence. Inside the van, Maxwell sat still, staring ahead as though caught in a trance, unmoved by the chaos he had unleashed. The weight of what he had done should have crushed him, but his face showed no sign of remorse, only a chilling calm. When the door finally creaked open, the officers braced themselves for resistance. But Maxwell stepped out slowly, deliberately, his hands raised in mechanical compliance. Witnesses and officers alike would later describe him not as frantic, not even angry, but detached, like a man who had already surrendered to his own fate long before the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The clicking of steel against his bones echoed in the night, and it wasn't just the sound of an arrest. It was the sound of years of hidden violence finally breaking the surface, of secrets too long ignored finally shackled by the law. Neighbors and bystanders who had followed the chaos from their doorsteps watched in horrified silence. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others turned away, unable to bear the sight of Maxwell's hollow stare as he was led toward the police cruiser. One officer, hardened by years on the force, later confessed that Maxwell's expression shook him to his core. It was like cuffing a man who had already left his soul behind. As Maxwell was pushed into the back of the squad car, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in for the entire community. The husband who had once appeared as the provider, the father who posed with his children for family photos, was now sitting in chains, his face blank, his silence louder than any confession could be. The night sky, still flashing with a relentless spin of sirens, seemed to close in on the tragedy. But beyond the arrest, beyond the sterile procedure of paperwork and evidence, there was a haunting truth. This was not just the capture of a criminal. It was the culmination of years of unspoken screams, of arguments muffled behind walls, of bruises hidden beneath clothing, of Rebecca's whispered warnings that had gone unanswered. It was the visible consequence of all the invisible battles that had been fought inside the Turner home, where fear had been allowed to grow unchecked until it finally exploded into unimaginable violence. And as Maxwell sat in the back of the cruiser, cuffed and expressionless, the narrative of this tragedy shifted. It was no longer just about the brutal night of October 30th. It became about what led to it, the failures that allowed it, and the reckoning that was now inevitable. The sirens faded into the distance as the cruiser drove away, carrying Maxwell into custody, but the echoes of that night lingered in every heart that bore witness. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the end of years of unspoken violence, the silencing of a woman's voice who had cried out in ways no one truly heard. It was proof that the scars of abuse, though invisible for years, always leave a trail that eventually demands to be seen. But how would a courtroom unravel the story behind this horrific night? And would justice finally speak for Rebecca when she no longer could? November 2024. The Franklin County Municipal Court buzzes with tension as Maxwell Turner, dressed in a plain suit, is led into the courtroom. He avoids eye contact with the gallery, his expression unreadable, like a man watching someone else's fate unfold, not his own. The prosecution paints him as a calculating abuser who controlled Rebecca's every move, a husband who made repeated threats and finally acted on them in the most brutal way. Their words strike like daggers, drawing on years of testimony from friends, neighbors, and Rebecca herself, her desperate 911 calls echoing through the courtroom like ghostly cries from beyond. The defense stumbles forward, grasping at mental instability, suggesting Maxwell snapped under emotional strain. But their arguments seem hollow. The jury doesn't see a broken man. They see a man who made deliberate choices, checking her phone, tying those knots, dragging her body in full view of the world. Then come the photographs. Images of Rebecca's battered body, lifeless and scarred from being dragged across the pavement. Jurors shift in their seats, some wiping their eyes, others looking down, unable to bear the horror staring back at them. One juror exhales sharply, like the weight of the truth just became too much to carry. The 911 tapes follow. Rebecca's trembling voice fills the room. "Please, he's going to kill me. I don't think I'll make it out alive." Her fear is no longer a story. It's alive, breathing, haunting everyone in that courtroom. This wasn't just a trial about facts. It was about a woman's life, her stolen chances, and the monster hiding behind the mask of a husband. As the evidence mounted, one question loomed over the jury, and perhaps over all of us. Was this a crime of sudden madness, or the cold execution of a man who had been planning Rebecca's end for years? The trial is unfolding in a packed courtroom, but outside those walls, 2 lives have already been shattered beyond repair. Rebecca and Maxwell's children, just 2 and 5 years old, are now caught in a tragedy far bigger than their little minds can grasp. While the world debated Maxwell's guilt, while prosecutors pieced together timelines and neighbors recalled screams, 2 children were learning their first lessons in loss. Not from school, not from a storybook, but from life itself. On the morning of October 31st, while crime scene investigators still combed the blood-stained driveway of the Turner home, Social services arrived at the small, brick house. Toys were scattered across the living room floor. A tiny plastic fire truck overturned on its side. A doll slumped against the wall, as if silently mourning its owner's absence. Rebecca's sister, Angela, had rushed to Ohio from Kentucky. She described walking into the children's room. 2 little beds neatly made, a stuffed rabbit resting on the pillow of the youngest. But the children were no longer there. They had already been placed into protective custody. Angela's tearful words, replayed for the documentary. I wanted to hold them. I wanted to tell them their mommy loved them. But the system said we had to wait. They were so small. They didn't even understand why everyone around them was crying. For the jury, the focus was on crime scene photos, evidence bags, and witness testimonies. But in living rooms across Ohio, parents watching the news asked themselves the harder question. What happens to the children left behind when love turns to violence, and a family is destroyed in one single night? Children this young don't fully process death the way adults do. For the 2-year-old, mommy is just gone. For the 5-year-old, there will be memories, the sound of her laugh, the feel of her hugs. But those memories will be forever tangled with the horror of how she died. Rebecca, who once cradled her babies with lullabies, is gone forever. Maxwell, the man who once tossed them in the air and promised he'd protect them, is now the reason their nights are filled with questions no bedtime story can answer. They are left to grow up in the long shadow of a father who murdered their mother. In schools, on playgrounds, even in adulthood, their surname will carry whispers. Those are the Turner kids. You know what their dad did. In the trial, when the prosecutor quietly mentioned, their children were asleep in that house as their mother was being beaten to death, a silence fell over the courtroom. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others clenched their jaws. It was no longer just about a crime. It was about innocence broken. 2 children, too young to understand, now condemned to a life without the gentle guidance of their mother, and forever tied to the violent legacy of their father. Can children ever truly escape the shadow of such a tragedy? Or does the ghost of that night follow them into every chapter of their future? The trial had stretched on for weeks, and when the jury was finally dismissed to deliberate, the air inside the courtroom grew thick with an unspoken weight. The families of both Rebecca and Maxwell sat in opposite corners, 2 worlds divided by an irreversible act of violence. On one side, Rebecca's parents clutched each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white, their faces hollowed by grief, waiting for a justice that could never truly heal their loss. On the other, Maxwell's relatives sat in a tense silence, their eyes lowered, as if struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the brutal murderer painted by the prosecution. Hours turned into a day. Every creak of the courtroom door made hearts pound. Every whisper from the bailiff brought heads snapping around in anxious expectation. Until finally, on a grey November afternoon, the jury returned. The foreman's voice was steady, but every syllable seemed to shake the walls. We, the jury, find the defendant, Maxwell Turner, guilty of murder in the 1st degree, guilty of felony evasion. The words cut through the silence like a blade. Gasps broke out from the gallery, followed by muffled sobs from Rebecca's mother, who buried her face into her husband's shoulder. The courtroom erupted into an almost unbearable mix of grief, vindication, and anger. Justice achieved, but at the heaviest possible cost. Maxwell stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face a mask drained of expression. No flicker of regret, no collapse into tears, no defiance. Just emptiness. Some jurors later admitted that his hollow stare was one of the most chilling things they had ever seen. Prosecutors leaned back in their seats, satisfied but weary. They knew this case wasn't just about winning, it was about making a statement. About showing that no matter how hidden domestic violence seemed behind closed doors, when it boiled over into tragedy, the system had to respond with full force. Then came sentencing. The judge's voice carried with it the weight of finality. Maxwell Turner, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His gavel struck once, echoing across the room like the last chapter closing on a dark and unforgivable story. Outside, the community gathered in clusters, reporters shoving microphones into the faces of anyone willing to speak. Some voices trembled with sorrow, mourning the young mother taken too soon. Others burned with fury, demanding more awareness, more protections for women trapped in violent homes. The tragedy had become more than just one family's nightmare. It had become a mirror, forcing the entire town to look at itself and ask the hard questions. Justice had been served, at least in the eyes of the law. Maxwell Turner would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But that verdict did not bring Rebecca back. It did not erase the years of terror she endured, nor did it silence the questions about what could have been done to save her. The community had their closure, but they also had a wound that would never fully heal. And then, almost like a whisper meant to linger in the audience's chest, the reflection sharpens. What warning signs were missed along the way? And if someone had acted sooner, could Rebecca's death have been prevented? It was about years of silence, of subtle bruises hidden under makeup, of whispered apologies that were never owed. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime born from control, from dominance, from abuse that festered in the shadows until it claimed a life. She was more than a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. And yet, her voice was silenced, leaving behind two children who must now grow up in the shadow of their father's crime. Their lives, forever divided into before and after. Domestic violence is not rare. 1 in 3 women will experience physical or emotional abuse in their lifetime. Every year, thousands never make it out alive. If you are watching this and you recognize Rebecca's story in your own life, or in the life of someone you know, please don't wait. Reach out. Call the hotline. Speak before silence takes everything. When love turns into fear, when promises of protection turn into chains of control, what is the cost of staying silent? For Rebecca, that cost was her life. For her children, it was the loss of both parents in a single night. For a community, it was the reminder that sometimes the monsters live in our very homes. If you had been Rebecca's friend, what would you have done to help her? Could you have seen the signs? Would you have spoken up? Or would silence have made you a bystander to tragedy? Share Rebecca's story. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Someone, somewhere, needs to hear what you have to say. And maybe, just maybe, it will give them the courage to walk away before it's too late. This has been the Crime Catalogue. If you made it this far, thank you for riding with us, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear the stories that must be told. And most importantly, share this video.